Is it possible to be in freeze and fight at the same time, switching back and forth between these two states? The answer is 100% yes, and I'll explain in a second. They then say, I feel disconnected and fatigued, followed by an adrenaline rush and vice versa. So 100% we can be in these states. Fight and flight is the sympathetic portion of our autonomic nervous system. Freeze is our parasympathetic nervous system, but it's a very specific branch of that nervous system, which is called our dorsal branch of the parasympathetic. So when it comes to being in fight and flight and freeze, I've added flight in. They said fight and freeze, but I put flight in. Yes, but, because there's always a but or an and, one will be more dominant. So one example, someone might be in a freezy way of living. I was like this. I was in a lot of functional freeze growing up. Never had one bout of sympathetic adrenaline that we would consider anxiety. And as we know, anxiety is merely survival stress, which is stored traumatic stress. That's a story for another day. I have other videos on those things. So for me, I was in functional freeze. As I started to come out and grow my capacity and work on my past traumas, accidents, early traumas, surgical traumas, all the things, and I just grew that capacity, all the work I've done on myself for many, many years, decades really, the freeze started to lift. So in some ways, it's like the brake came off, and then my system expressed all of the fight and flee that had been under that freeze for, in my case, since in utero. We could even say there's probably some transgenerational trauma in there. That's not important right now. So yes, we can have this deep freeze, but under is fight. And so if you're starting to heal at this level, slowly, foundationally, building capacity, this can occur. Now, the interesting thing is, even when we're not healing, if we're living life and we're stuck in this, we would call it dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, we flip. And this is exactly what this person said. Disconnected, fatigued, followed by adrenaline rush. It is the system, it is the autonomic nervous system. It doesn't know how to drive. So if I go back to the car analogy, if you've ever tried to drive a stick and you've never driven a stick, it isn't typically something that comes intuitively. Even if you've been watching someone drive a standard transmission all your life, until you feel that balance of the clutch and the gas, all the things, it doesn't really make sense until you're in it. And then you go into a different car and it's completely different. That would be equivalent to you're fine when you're at home or in a safer space, and then you go to somewhere that is not as familiar, a bit more loud, a bit more intense, and you don't know how to drive your vehicle because it's in a very, very, we would call it narrow window of tolerance, or maybe no window of tolerance. We're in this functional freeze with this flip between high-level fight and high-level freeze. Now, if I parallel this to chronic conditions that many people have, certain things like migraine headache, IBS, Crohn's, we might call it that as well, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, chronic pain syndromes, Raynaud's in the finger, more extreme would be RSD. These syndromes, and that's what we call them, syndromal representations, where we are in this fight, flight, freeze, and the system doesn't know which to pick. One of the classic examples is something like chronic diarrhea or chronic constipation, which is usually what happens with someone who is living with, say, IBS, is they are in this constant flux between fight, flight, and freeze. And so the system goes from chronic constipation, fight, flight, everything is slow and constricted, to freeze, which oddly lets things go much quicker. It opens things up, and that's where you get the chronic diarrhea. Over time, as this occurs back and forth, the gut doesn't have a chance to heal. And then this is where we get, for instance, leaky gut. This is where we get just digestive problems, pain, sensitivities to food. We're not absorbing our food properly because the cells of the gut, they're called the villi, they're not sucking in nutrients properly because they're in a constant state of flux. They're basically in dysregulation. Another common syndrome for the ladies, chronic PMS, premenstrual syndrome. Again, you've got these organs that are meant to have a very specific timing and flow, but if there is this signal, not just from the brain, but from the entire autonomic nervous system branches, which is brain through the entire spinal cord to these organs, and if the trapped traumatic stress, for whatever reason it's there, I won't get into the differences. I have 3 videos on my site called the Healing Trauma Series. It gets into the 3 different kinds of trauma. So if we're living in this dysregulation, there's no coherence and flow through the autonomic nervous system. It's in dysregulation, going back and forth between fight, flight, and freeze, back and forth, just constantly going. And then the reproductive organs, in this case, for the women, it's the uterine lining, that cavity, the ovaries, and just the way that entire area works is going to be under this pressure and strain. It doesn't know what to do. This is one example. It's not the only reason why PMS occurs. There's a lot of other factors, but this is one that many of my students find as they get more regulated in their nervous system, these syndromes start to shift. And then our body just never has a chance to rest. So when it's cycling back and forth between these 3 states, really it's 2, it's sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic high tone dorsal freeze. It's just constantly in a state of survival, and it's exhausting. There comes a point typically, and this is what we'll see in someone who, say, represents as having fibromyalgia or chronic pain, chronic fatigue. This is very common in what we would call autoimmune troubles. Over time, eventually, that adrenaline, the heightened fight flight, it just doesn't show up anymore. There's some controversy about whether or not adrenal fatigue is real. I believe it is a real thing, whether you want to call it that or not. The system has been taxed for too long. You've been revving that engine too long. Start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. Imagine if you had a car and all you did was that all day long and you didn't just drive it, right? It wouldn't last very long. It would wear out. The clutch would wear out, the brakes would wear out, and it just wouldn't be used in the way it's supposed to be used. Then it breaks down. And so this is what's occurring when we no longer have that adrenaline rush that this person is talking about. And that is actually when we know we've kind of reached low capacity. Our system is now shutting down. It can't muster that adrenalized energy to fight. And so what we want to do as we heal this stuff is we want to be titrated. That means slow. We want to go slow, go intentionally, do little bits of somatic work. And my way of somatic work is very much unique to the methodologies I practice and teach, namely somatic experiencing, the Feldenkrais method, and the more early trauma pieces that I've learned through my mentors, namely Kathy Kane and Stephen Terrell, working with the organ systems that go on alert when we are in this ping pong back and forth. The kidneys, the gut, the brainstem, the fascia, the heart space, area called the mediastinum. We want to work with these actual organ tissues through our intention, through our touch. This is what I teach in Smart Body, Smart Mind. Or if you were to work with a practitioner who has this training, they wouldn't just start getting you doing big movements. They would teach you subtle, somatic, I call them neurosensory exercises, but some people might call them somatic exercises. It's not about how many you do and how much you do. It's about restoring our ability to feel and sense and not be overwhelmed by what we feel and sense. Our ability to digest and integrate what we are experiencing when we get more connected to our system, but most importantly, or also just as importantly, the environment around us. This is this concept of orienting to the outside world and being able to go back and forth between the outside world and the internal world in a nice, flowing, cohesive, coherent way. When we're stuck in this sympathetic, adrenalized state, coupled with this parasympathetic, dorsal shutdown state, the system doesn't have good flow. It's rigid, it's compressed, or it's just, it's completely loosey-goosey and there's no boundaries. This is another common trait that we'll see in someone who has a lot of sympathetic energy and they can't handle it, they can't hold it, then the system collapses and it's like they're a puddle and there's very little containment in not just their emotions and their sensations, but even their tissues become doughy and very lax. Joints become overly flexible to a degree that isn't good and can harm someone. That is my answer to that question. I'm not going to get into other questions because I want to keep this specific to this one, but just know that the fight, the flight, and the freeze, we need them, but we don't want them to be competing with each other. And when they're bouncing back and forth, that is autonomic nervous system dysregulation. When it happens chronically over years, over decades, which for many of us, that's the case, this is where we end up with illness, chronic illness, these symptoms of the autonomic nervous system physiology, which is anything that autonomic nervous system touches. So all of our organs, our heart, our lungs, our tissues, and our ability to connect with others and the outside world. So that autonomic nervous system is just not for the digestion and the immune system, for example. It is also, it gives us the ability to be with others, to parent, to connect, to attune, but also to use our higher brain to problem solve, to create, to figure things out, and to go into action. So we want to be able to act, but we also want to be able to rest and digest, to use that term. So if you haven't started with my other resources, I do recommend the Healing Trauma video series. It is on my site. It's very easy to find. Just look for Healing Trauma 3-part video training, completely free, 3 videos. They're polished. I'm a little younger in them, but the messaging is on point. It's still accurate. Some really important analogies. I get into some of the research that backs this up. And there's worksheets and handouts with each video just to supplement the learning. So thank you, everyone. Signing off from this question.